It is the result of a collaboration between our company, NeoMetrics, which is a guidewire manufacturing firm in the Minneapolis metropolitan area, and the folks at Memory Says Getter. The two companies have worked together over the last 10 years to develop a number of novel alloys, one of which was a cobalt chromium alloy that was designed to achieve higher stiffness moduluses. And we had some success in the early going, but didn't have all the properties that we were achieving for ultimate guidewire performance. And so in more recent development efforts, we've been able to achieve what we think is a major breakthrough in guidewire material selection. We, of course, work extensively with binary nitai for guidewires. About half of the guidewires that we manufacture are made out of nitinol. And certain applications like coronary PTCA and other fine wire applications, nitinol's physical properties are not suitable to effective navigation or delivery of devices. The material has a tendency to be a little soft. We'll go up to next one here. A little bit of information about NeoMetrics. NeoMetrics was founded in 2001 primarily as a finished OEM guidewire manufacturer. We incorporate a full range of capabilities, which includes not only the design work on guidewires, but all of the design control and regulatory approvals. So what we typically do is we offer a range of specifications by clinical indication. So for instance, if you have a need for a PTCA wire, we have a regulatory approval that brackets a variety of specifications within that clinical segment, and we can customize a wire working within our own 510K and design documentation documents. We also make a variety of other wire-based devices, not only components, but also snares, embolectomy products, other things that are guide wires, similar to guide wires in design. We're based on the west side of Minneapolis in an area called Medical Alley, and we have about a 40,000 square foot facility located with about 120 employees right now. We do not sell any of our wires to the clinical environment. Everything that we do is sold on an OEM basis, and we work primarily with Fortune 500 medical device firms and early stage companies that are still in the development cycles. What we've decided to do is focus on incremental enhancements to existing design platforms to provide incremental improvement in performance or cost reduction. And one of the milestone products that we launched in the beginning of the company was a line of infusion catheter PIC type guide wires incorporating tungsten alloys as opposed to platinum. And in many of our products you'll find that we have essentially spec'd out all the platinum content in lieu of other lower cost radiopaque metals such as tungsten and palladium. Our team has an extensive amount of experience with nickel titanium alloys, but about half of our product mix is stainless steel as well. When we look at the various segments for guide wires in terms of clinical application, we serve a variety of markets, one of which is the peripheral vascular market, which is essentially any part of the vasculature outside of the coronary and the brain. The coronary vasculature, the cerebral vasculature for neuroradiology, the hepatopancreatic endoscopy market, which is generally upper GI, biliary tract access and pancreatic duct access, and lastly vascular access, which is typically for the placement of PICC lines and micro access for getting into the venous system. When we look at guidewire design, we focus in on a variety of physical properties and physical attributes that really drive the performance of the wire. This relates primarily to the core material, not so much the selection of coil material or tip configuration. But one of the most critical elements of guidewire design is the column strength or the pushability of the wire. This is a function of not only the material, but also coatings that might be used, whether they're hydrophilic, PTFE, silicone. But in terms of the drive to improve binary nitinol performance, column strength was one of the key targets in trying to improve the column strength of a superelastic alloy. Torqueability is also a critical factor. Given the softness of niti, its torque properties are not as good as stainless steel, and it has a tendency to build up a lot of torsional energy, which when navigating through a very tortuous path, it will build up energy and then release, causing a very severe whipping effect. And we wanted to eliminate that property of binary niti in this new material as well. Another frustrating feature of guidewire performance for the physician is what we call a torque lag, which is when the proximal end of the wire is torqued, there is a consummate concurrent lag in the transmission of that torque to the distal tip of the wire. And again, nitinol is notorious for having a non-responsive torque lag property. Lubricity obviously is critical, especially in tight strictures, and hydrophilic wires are very widely used. Tip flexibility, we focus on tip flexibility matched to the anatomical scenario being dealt with. And so that is something that can be almost infinitely adjusted depending on the anatomy of the patient and the requirements. Now, we have a nomenclature system in the guidewire world where we measure tip flexibility in terms of grams of force. And so in PTCA wires, physicians are very accustomed to saying, well, I'd like a 12-gram tip, a very stiff tip, or a 2-gram tip, which is a very light tip. And they speak that language in terms of tip flexibility. Another property is also the length of the grind profile, or the attenuation of the diameter at the distal tip, which is what we call the rail support of the material and the grind profile. The rail support is really the backbone of a guide wire for the delivery of various devices. Without the rigidity of the rail strength of the material, certain devices just can't be delivered, especially when they're moving through a highly resistive environment like a blood vessel with lesions or blood clot. The tensile strength and fatigue resistance, we focus on these primarily from a safety perspective. There are requirements for tensile strength. The good news is all of these materials meet essentially all the tensile requirements. One area that the physicians rely on heavily is after they have assessed the condition of the patient, have a feel for the navigational path that they need to take with the wire, they many times would like to modify the wire's tip configuration from what it was provided with in the packaging. And so physicians are very adept at modifying the tip configuration of a wire actually while they're standing over the patient. And the ability of the wire to retain that tip modification by the physician is critical. There's nothing more frustrating to an interventionalist than to set a tip profile, go into the patient, and have the tip migrate to its original shape. And of course, nitinol is notorious for that. This new material, because of some of the annealing technologies that we use, the tip retention is extremely good. And then lastly, prolapse. Preventing prolapse from happening is really a function of many of these other parameters, the lateral support and the tip flexibility. Basic guidewire construction 101, and many of you in the audience here probably know about this. There are an infinite variety of guidewires, but one category of design would be what you see here, which is a solid core guidewire, an attenuation or a tapering of the tip done by centerless grinding, much as the Royal Masters and the Glee bar machines can do here. A distal tip which has a radiopaque coil on it or some radiopaque material. In some cases, a safety wire or a very, very fine diameter distal tip for navigational purposes. And then over the top of that, potentially radiopaque polymers or primer layers, tie layers for the application of hydrophilic coatings and other slippery distal tip coatings. Thus far, the selection options for guidewire design have been fairly limited. we've had a choice between stainless steel and binary nitai. The advantage of stainless steel is that it has a very high bending modulus, very good for support, especially for small diameter wires. Has great column strength, very pushable, but it deforms at very low strain levels. In other words, the material, once it's been deformed, it cannot recover to its original shape. And when that happens clinically, the physician basically has to remove the wire and start over with something that might be able to handle the strain it's being put under. Binary nitinol is just kind of the evil twin of stainless steel. It has a very low bending modulus. It's very soft material, but it is highly elastic, highly recoverable, even upon fairly high strain conditions, which can be as high as 7% strain. And of course, that's a function of the wire diameter. The nice thing about nitinol is that because of the strain recovery, the physician can really navigate some very tough anatomy and abuse the wire, so to speak, without it taking a permanent set. But in terms of its pushability and its softness, it's not capable of delivering heavy interventional devices, especially when there's a small diameter, or the wire is a very small diameter. Another technology that's arrived on the market in the last 10 to 15 years is the use of bimetal cores. Bimetal cores are basically taking the attributes of nitinol and putting that on the tip of the guide wire and using the stainless steel or the pushability and column strength of stainless on the proximal end of the guide wire. And there are a number of wires out there that incorporate the bimetal design. There is some asynchrony between the torque transmission of the two materials, so you can imagine that when the stainless steel is torqued, you don't get a commensurate transmission of the torque to the distal nitinol tip. And there's a little bit of a training curve with the doctors, but these wires have become popular in certain applications. One in particular is PTCA. So to really summarize some of the advantages and disadvantages, nitinol, obviously very resilient, able to navigate diseased and highly stenosed vessels, but very low on support. We like to think of it as a four-wheel drive truck, being able to go through some pretty tough conditions. It conforms to the anatomy without deformation. The clinical disadvantages: inadequate support for devices, very low rail support, especially in small diameters. So when you get into wires that are used for neuroradiology, going up into the brain for embolotherapy or embolectomy, nitinol wires are great for that, but they generally don't have the rail support of stainless steel. So the solution to this performance gap between the two different materials is what we're calling the Trident Alloy. And the Trident Alloy is actually a modification of binary nitai, which incorporates a cobalt component. And for those of you who are chemists, you may know that nickel and cobalt reside next to each other on the periodic table. And the interesting property that cobalt imparts to this material is it raises the peak loading forces, or the modulus, for lack of a better term, of this material, while retaining the superelastic properties of nitai. So getting into smaller diameter guide wires, it provides much more rail support and pushability than a standard binary nitai. It has superior torque transmission properties, and we think it may eliminate the need for bimetal type wires where, as I mentioned earlier, there's a fusion of stainless and binary nitai. What we're also finding is that there are certain applications like jacketed wires where an outer jacket is required for electrical insulation. The core material diameter is maximized because the jacket has to be a certain size and the OD of the product has to be a certain size. And this material allows an increase in stiffness, superelastic behavior, while maintaining the fixed diameter constraints that the engineer has to deal with. So our goal was to really bridge the gap between the stainless market and the nitinol market. And based on the testing that we've done so far, we think this material will actually do that. Right now, only about, in interventional cardiology, only about 10% of the Guidewire families that are out there, now these are groupings of products as opposed to every individual code, are about 10% nitinol. And the bimetal wires represent about 5% of the families, but they represent a huge percentage of the actual total volume. The BMW wire, which many of you are familiar with, the balanced middleweight from Abbott is the #1 selling wire. That is a bimetal wire. And of course, the technology and the cost of bringing those two metals together in a single Guidewire design is fairly expensive. So the solution to that problem is to come up with a wire that has a single body construction, a unibody construction, but have the column strength on the core, the proximal core, and the flexibility and superelasticity on the distal tip. As I mentioned earlier, what we've done with this material is we've incorporated a cobalt element to the nickel titanium crystal structure, and as a result of that, we've increased the modulus of the material by about 40%. In terms of some of the actual numbers, the loading plateau stresses for binary nitai are about 492 MPa, or 71 KSI. This material and the equivalent diameter at 3% strain is at 710, a significant increase. The unloading plateau stresses coming the hysteresis curve are 226 for nitai and 439 for the cobalt nitico. So you can see across the board the stiffness properties of the material, both in loading conditions and unloading conditions, are considerably higher than binary nitai. This is the typical 3-point bend test with the hysteresis curve. If you look at the two loading curves side by side, you can see that the peak loading forces are about 40% higher. Getting back to the effect of strain on stainless steel, this again is a 3-point bend test showing the loading of the stainless steel to a maximum strain level, and then when the load is released, the wire does not go back to its original 0 starting point. That's the plastic deformation that we talked about earlier. The Triton alloy, right between stainless steel and binary nitai, but a hysteresis curve similar to binary nitai, but going back to a 0 starting point for within 7% strain. In terms of pushability, we've also measured this in our laboratory under various test conditions. We're measuring we can share our test method with you if you'd like, but we're measuring about a 43% increase in the pushability of the material as well, which is also a function of the material's peak loading forces. In terms of torque response, we've eliminated a significant amount of the torque lag seen with binary nitai, and in terms of actual torque transmission, we get about a 26% better torque response. So what are we planning to do with this material? As I mentioned earlier, NeoMetrics' business model is to bracket a variety of design specifications within clinical segments and then offer our customers the ability to spec out guide wires within those ranges. What we have done so far is we have pursued FDA clearance for a line of interventional radiology or peripheral vascular wires and also PTCA wires. And we received the clearance for this new material in a specification range of wires back in September. Have just been wrapping up our design verification work, and we are pleased to report that in PTCA applications where nitinol wires have failed miserably, this wire is performing beautifully and does provide the superelastic tip that prevents deformation and having to start over again. We had a few testimonials here from the doctors that had actually done the cases for us, and almost universally we're finding that the torque transmission around multiple turns is superior to even stainless steel. It tracks extremely well, and the torque transmission is nearly 1-to-1. Easy steerability for crossing various lesions or instant restenosis. And so we feel that we have a winner here in terms of being able to bridge the performance gap. Our next steps are basically to pursue other clinical applications. We are actually in the process right now of developing a line of GI endoscopy wires that incorporate this new alloy. Most of the wires that are on the market are 0.35 inch in diameter. They are constrained by a core requirement of about 0.29, and despite that limitation, the stiffness of the wires isn't as high as it should be with binary nitride. This material solves that problem by staying within the 0.29 design constraint but providing greater stiffness. So NeoMetrics, with this new alloy and some of the other capabilities that we have with our specification library, is seeking business relationships and partnerships. We've already talked to most of the major companies in the industry about this new alloy as a Guidewire partner to the memory folks, and I'd be interested in speaking to anybody here that has interest in this type of material in a Guidewire application. We also have our national sales director, Doug Pletcher, here, who can also answer any questions relative to the material's properties. Thank you.